It's the first working day of the week. Top of the morning to you and welcome to Business Morning. I am BC Adebayo. It was an eventful weekend at the crude oil market as OPEC Plus agreed on Saturday to extend the output cut deal by a third month through the end July. And following the deal, the world's top exporter, Saudi Arabia, sharply raised its monthly crude prices for July. And as expected, oil prices surged big time, with Brent rising as high as $43 per barrel, but has since given up some of those early gains as optimism over major crude producers deal gave way to disappointment that the accord didn't extend beyond the end of July. And Brent crude was trading up 0.5% at $42.51 a barrel, while US WTI crude also rose 0.05% to $39.57 a barrel after touching $40.44 earlier. Both hit their highest since March the 6th. And since the start of April, oil prices have doubled, propped up by the unprecedented production cut of 9.7 million barrels per day, which is nearly 10% of global supplies agreed in April by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Russia, and other allies, collectively known as OPEC+. Well, we'll be dwelling on the latest developments in the crude oil market today on the program, and the conversation begins right away with Rolake Akikugbe-Filani, Managing Director at Energy Inc. Advisors. Good morning, Rolake. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Good morning, Bissy. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The new OPEC deal extension of output cut firmly establishes the role of Russia and, by extension, Saudi Arabia as the bona fide price leader in this market. In this regard now, do you think that OPEC can now act without Russia and the U.S. support in future?
Thanks for that question. I mean, let's put things in perspective. Let's look at each of those three protagonists in this story, their share of global production. The U.S. is currently somewhere above 15% of total global production. Saudi and Russia are roughly neck and neck at around 12% of global production. So the reality is that these three key players actually need each other. And as you know, for the past 18 months or more, OPEC has been taking its strategic decisions on balancing the oil market in collaboration with Russia and the group of OPEC Plus producers. So it's clear to say that Russia has been critical to helping to rebalance the market, number one. The second thing to point out is that the US, as an independent producer, was actually putting pressure on both OPEC, Saudi, and the Russians to come up with an agreement. So I think the conclusion there is that it would be impossible to see how they could effectively balance the oil market without working collaboratively. The other thing is, when you look at the market drivers now, it seems that markets are now beginning to read Saudi and Russian cooperation as a key driver of market stability in the near term. So I think that is here to stay as the main driver to look at going forward.
As part of fallout of the meeting now, the group also demanded that Nigeria and Iraq, which exceeded production quotas in May and June, compensate with extra cuts in July to September. What will that change in Nigeria's oil production in the next few months ahead?
Well, I think there was a comment by the Minister of State, Timothy Silva, about the whole compensation strategy. And I don't think it's a totally unreasonable expectation, particularly if they have not had a history of consistently complying over a period. I think the challenge for Nigeria domestically is to ensure that it even maintains a stable production level. And as you know, over the last few years, that hasn't necessarily been the case. We also face the double jeopardy of seeing an erosion in our revenue base as a country. So trying to balance the strategic imperatives of OPEC versus what our own domestic imperatives are is going to be quite difficult. But I think the signals that will be sent out by the ministry here locally is that Nigeria will try and play ball. Whether that can be underpinned by the operational reality on the ground will be a totally different issue.
I will wait to see that. Now, the price of oil fell in a very rare scenario to below zero sometime last month. Of course, it has since recovered sharply, jumping by 50% in the past 4 weeks. But what do you think is a fair estimate or forecast for Brent for the rest of the year?
Bissy, thanks for that question. I always say if I had a clear crystal ball, I would be a billionaire right now. Well, so let's look at it from two ways. So if you look at what has happened to Brent, we're seeing more than a 30% drop in global demand, which has significantly knocked off prices. And WTI in the US obviously fell to negative. I think at worst it was minus $37 a barrel. Most global analysts, so some of the major global investment banks, are circling somewhere around an average price of $40 a barrel for 2020. And a lot of them have actually had to review their forecast upwards slightly because of the action that's been taken by OPEC and OPEC Plus. So here are four key things that I wanted you to look out for. There's been a backlog of inventories in global oil stocks, i.e. the actual amount of supplies that's being unsold. And we're not going to see new storage capacity catch up effectively to materially absorb all the extra inventories. And I think there's still uncertainty over the full realization and impact of COVID-19 as a pandemic. We're seeing recovery in key markets such as China, obviously, to a lesser extent, India, which is also a big global consumer. And there's still uncertainty over the sustainability of this new era of cooperation with OPEC. So all in all, if we take forecasts like the Energy Information Administration in the US, which is predicting $34 a barrel, and some of the big global economic analysts who are around the $40 a barrel mark, I would say maybe just shy of $40 a barrel would be a reasonable prediction. However, I always caution that to effectively predict oil prices, you need to do extensive and detailed economic modeling. So if we're taking an average of what the global consensus is by the credible agencies, I would say a $40 mark is not unreasonable. And actually, given a lot of the uncertainties with this global black swan events, we shouldn't be surprised if we still see some dips in the cycle later in H2 of 2020.
We've seen a big difference between Nigeria's productivity and its production. Of course, that's because of suboptimal new investments by major oil companies. What would you suggest as a package of incentives to encourage investments in the country?
I think these package of incentives we refer to, these are things that are known pretty much anybody who's been following the industry. We always talk about a stable regulatory and fiscal framework. That is key. And I think what you actually mean to refer to is our capacity to produce, which is linked to our reserves base and our actual production that we see daily. Obviously, the PIB has to be passed at some point. And I think the tax incentives are going to be quite key because over the last 2-3 decades, what has pertained is that when companies have had challenges with the fiscal framework or the tax levels, they've gone directly to negotiate side letters with the regulatory agencies about wanting tax holidays and tax breaks. And we've seen some of that being deployed. Now, what we're asking from is we need some uniformity. We need some predictability. That is very, very important because let's not forget, if you want to take a single first investment decision on a major oil and gas investment, you have to cross your T's and dot your I's. And currently now in Nigeria, that is not necessarily the case. So for instance, we want to see petroleum profit tax and royalties honoring the location, so your geographic location, whether that's onshore or offshore, based on how much it costs you to produce in each type of territory or terrain. So I would say certainly the fiscal and regulatory framework, the security situation in the Niger Delta, we've obviously seen some improvements in the past few years, but that will further help drive down production costs because by and large now, most companies are having to deploy their own security strategy, and that is piling on the costs. So let's get the PIGB passed. Let's try and overcome the hurdles to why there's sort of a disagreement in views around that. And let's see that through. That will be one positive that comes out of the industry in 2020 if we're able to scale it.
What about a country like India now, which is the largest importer of Nigerian oil? Of course, that country is fast-tracking the use of electric cars and stopping the use of petrol-fired vehicles. What would be the macroeconomic implications of the impending obsolescence of oil and growing irrelevance of OPEC and, by extension, Nigeria?
Well, the impending obsolescence of oil, I think it's important to realize that today in our daily lives, we use so many derivatives of oil, from asphalt to petrochemicals to plastics. And of course, let's not forget gas. I think what we're seeing is that the global energy transition is being played out in different ways. the bigger consuming markets in the emerging world, like China and India, need to diversify their fuel mix because, frankly, their dependency on imported oil is becoming a major challenge for their development. So naturally, they will transition. However, we're not going to see an end to oil for many decades to come. I think the reality is about diversification locally. The second thing is about how we absorb our own production and more of our own production so that we create local centers of demand within Nigeria. Beyond just the introduction of electric vehicles, we're also seeing things like global regulation. The International Maritime Agency at the start of this year started a new regime around controlling high sulfur fuel oil for bunkers, for shipping offshore. So those things will need to force Nigeria to think inwardly. But this idea that somehow hydrocarbons will be phased out within the next decade or two, I think we need to moderate that view and realize that for African economies in particular, what we need is diversity in our fuel mix, in our energy mix, and how we balance what is the most cost-effective and cheapest way to utilize and to produce oil. I think that's what we need to do. I think gas will be a key part of that because let's not forget that if we're bringing electric vehicle charging points, they need to be powered, they need to be electrified. And the main source of electrification today in Nigeria is gas-fired. So we obviously need to build and develop our local gas infrastructure, obviously incorporate other alternative fuels such as solar energy, whose costs have been falling consistently over many years.
It's been quite an interesting conversation with you, Rolake Akikuwe Filani, Managing Director at Energy Inc. Advisors. Thanks for speaking with us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Bissy. Have a good day.
All right, let's continue the program now, talking about the Petroleum Products Pricing Regulatory Agency, which has come out to clear the air on the recent publication stating that the price cap per litre in respect of petroleum motor spirits is removed and that market-based pricing regime for petrol has taken effect. In a press release, the agency says it does not confer on marketers the power to fix prices for the products as they deem fit, but rather guiding prices would be advised by the PPPRA according to market realities. Well, joining us now to make sense of this regulation is the chairman of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, Nigerian Council, Mr. Joseph Nwakwe. Good morning and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Bissy. How are you?
Very well. Now, although the PPPRA has now cleared the air on its role in terms of pricing of petrol, but what do you understand by the details of the policy document, specifically when we talk about the Section 3, Subsection 2 of the document, which addresses the removal of a price cap on PMS?
Well, clearly the intention, from what I see, is the restoration of the pricing template that we had in 2016. Basically, what they intend to do is to eliminate subsidies, but not completely stop price fixing. I don't know if you get the difference. So clearly, if you read the regulation that was released in March, the PPPRA regulation, basically, price fixing is still the deal. However, they will fix that price at a level that enables them to fully recover cost. So if they do that, clearly, you don't have a subsidy, but the market pricing is set by government. That's what really I understand that to mean. So we're not quite at a fully deregulated market, if you look at that.
And so what does this mean for the marketers?
Well, what it means is it has two implications. One is the fact that they will continue to depend on NNPC for products. I do not see that they can go and import products, given that PPPRA will still fix the prices, right? So if they run any loss doing that, they will have no means to recover the difference, which is the subsidy element. So I reckon that most of them will say, well, let's wait for NNPC to bring products, we'll take it from the depot, and we sell, make whatever margin there is. So we are still stuck in this single supply situation. So that's a major problem.
The ensuing media statement, of course, further explains that the published regulation does not confer on marketers the power to fix prices for petrol, but that the PPPRA will continue to advise according to market realities. But what does the law that's talking about the Petroleum Act, the Price of Control Act, as well as the PPPRA Act say about the oversight functions of the agency when we talk about petrol price?
Well, the regime, the legal framework today is that the PA and the Price Control Act clearly give the minister, in this case, the Minister of Petroleum, as far as the Petroleum Act goes, has the duty, the responsibility to fix prices, while the Price Control Act actually puts that in the Minister for Commerce, or whatever that question is. So really, looking at the laws, we still have a situation where it is the duty of government to fix prices of products, petroleum products generally. So if we need to reform that system, there has to be some legislative activity around cleaning up our books, making sure that those provisions are not there that allows a minister to fix a price for a product, whether it's even kerosene and all the other ones that has been deregulated. If you strictly go by the law, the government should still continue to fix prices for those products. I don't remember what happened to the case. I think there was a case in 2013, 2014 by some lawyer, basically asking the court, and I think a federal high court said that the government could not deregulate because it was a legal obligation. But I don't know what happened. I understand there was an appeal. I don't know how it ended. But I think the important thing is that if we want to reform this sector, we need to have a holistic view of a situation where only one entity supplies the market. That's a problem. Fixing the price, that's a problem. So there are components of this that we need to take and look at before we come up with this, a reform solution that will enable the market to grow. Because if you think about it, a country this size, there's a lot of potential for the downstream, and we're not realizing it at all.
So if you're talking about solutions now, what are some of the solutions that you would prefer?
Okay, so if you're thinking about solutions, everywhere else, the midstream is built from people who developed skill in the downstream. And when I talk about I'm talking about transportation, refining, processing. We don't have a lot of midstream players. It tells you that the downstream has not been successful, because if people are successful in the downstream, they scale up to the midstream and up to the upstream. So that's a natural progression that we haven't quite seen in Nigeria because of the framework we have. So there are a lot of opportunities in refining. There are a lot of opportunities in gas processing. There are a lot of opportunities that we just are not taking advantage of because we haven't built sufficient enough capabilities in the downstream. I mean, a couple of years back, you knew the downstream companies were fairly strong. Now they're all just out there. Not a whole lot is happening in that space. So it says a lot about the framework, the market framework that we have. So the structure of the market is a problem. Pricing is a problem. So there are a lot of issues. Infrastructure is a problem. So there are quite a few areas that we need to reform.
So this issue now actually brings me to talking about the timing now. Do you think that this could have come at a better time, or is this the right time for this?
The right time was yesterday. So yes, today, for a couple of reasons. One, prices are actually low at this point. So there are no real differences in, so this is a good time in terms of the pricing. In terms of when we needed it 10 years ago, we should have done this. So I think it's in the right direction to deregulate the market. I think that removal of subsidy is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Okay, I think we need to go the whole hog. We need to completely reform the sector for growth. That's the way I would. So removing subsidy could be the first step in doing that, but it is necessary that we move beyond just removing subsidy. Because if you remove subsidy through a modulation scheme, it's still price fixing, right? You're not going to be able to attract the private capital that you need to drive that growth. And government doesn't have the resources to fund that sector today. So if our objective is to grow a bigger pie, to grow that sector, we really need to step back and say, well, we're going to need private capital to do that. And a major precondition for that is that you remove all of these impediments. Price fixing is one of them.
All right, now, does the petroleum industry bill have any possible solutions for the full deregulation of the downstream? Because, of course, we understand that the NNPC GMD, that's Mr. Melekiari, once said that the PIB wasn't necessary to actually achieve deregulation.
Well, I haven't seen that comment, but what I can say is that there are opportunities here for alignment. So the PIB, the way it was always thought of, was to open up the sector, and that's upstream, midstream, and downstream. So there might be elements of that whole thing that will impact on whether you're in a deregulated market or not. For instance, let's look at the PIGB, which was the institutional framework. The attempt has always been to streamline the number of institutions in that sector. I mean, we have PEF, we have PPPRA. All of these institutions where PPPRA, for instance, was set up for a sole purpose, fixed prices. So if you're in a deregulated market, then that institution has to either go or be transformed to something else. You couldn't have PPPRA fixing prices in a deregulated market. You couldn't have equalization the way we think about it today, which is price equalization, in a fully deregulated market. So it's always something that, so there are components of the reform process, which is what you call the PIGB, that will necessarily mean that things will be done differently. And that's why I think that alignment is necessary. We need to have, we are being forced, the timing is being forced today because of the low prices we see. But I would have preferred a situation where the reform bills have been looked at alongside this process so that we establish the synergies. Because right now, those institutions we either have to disband or find other purposes for them, right? Because that would not work in a fully deregulated market. You can't have PPPRA. So those are the kind of things that needs to happen. And the governance bill would have dealt with that. So that's where the PIB comes into this.
You've talked about synergy now, but what are some of the other economic realities that could be preventing the federal government from granting total deregulation to the downstream?
Economic realities. It's kind of, okay, you and I mean, we've been here. We were here when we moved from 97 or thereabout to 145. So the notion was that people were going to die, right? Well, I don't remember that anyone died. So my sense is that it's more political than economic. I think that the Nigerians are better served economically when there is efficiency in that space. I think what we've been doing over the years has not worked for us economically. It has served certain political interests, I would say, but I think that I, as a person, I see the losses. I could count my losses from the government taking this route. I think that Nigerians will be better served, and I mean that economically, if we have a fully deregulated market.
With this policy statement now, would there be any legal basis for which marketers may actually proceed to import petrol without consequences possibly occasioned by a sudden reversal of the policy, for instance?
Well, that's why I think it needs to be done properly. If there are laws that say that price fixing is the rule of the game, we need to get the legislature involved and make sure that those laws are changed. Because remember, there's a political time clock that's ticking away, right? How politicians react influences a whole lot of things. So if we do things without dotting all the I's and crossing the T's, you might see reversals in 2023 when people start using it as a political issue, because this is a hot burner issue politically, right? So we need to make sure that whatever changes are done properly so that they are sustainable in the long term.
But what if we begin to see the prices actually go up? What would you
expect?
Crude
prices.
What would you expect the PPPRA, or how would you expect them to actually manage the situation?
If crude prices go up, of course the guiding price will go up, which is what they call it, right? The guiding price will go up. The problem with that, though, is that it's very complicated, because on a month-on-month basis, you're revising prices, and people don't empty their tanks every month. So you're going to have challenges administering this scheme the way it's being thought of. There are issues that the guidelines I've seen do not quite address all the issues. So I think they need to communicate a lot better what their real intentions are, if you ask me. But I think that we should fix our eyes at the real goal, which is to fully get out of price fixing.
Talking about the PPPRA's role of course, advising the NNPC and oil marketers on indicative market price now, but the big question has actually always been the rates of compliance by marketers. Of course, what do we know about the monitoring and enforcement of these prices?
Okay, so that's why, again, I like market-based solutions, right? When you do things that require too much monitoring and enforcement. How many people we have probably more than 8,000 filling stations in the country, right? So how many people do you have working in the enforcement arm to police this? So if you had a market-based solution, it relieves you of that obligation to keep running around trying to check who is doing that. So regulation should be a bit more about quality and service quality, right? Rather than just pricing, price fixing and all that. So my sense is, if you look at the history, go to Bureau of Statistics database, look at the prices. They publish prices by state in the last 3-4 years. I've plotted it. It's only 3 places that you go and prices are based on whatever. It's Abuja, it's Lagos, and some parts of Port Harcourt. Everywhere else in this country, the prices are not being honored. So we shouldn't continue to deceive ourselves.
All right, we need to wrap up this conversation very quickly. So in just about 30 seconds, tell us, if Nigeria was to fully deregulate now, what would be the right price of petrol today?
I haven't seen what the template looks like. The last template I saw was in March. Again, so it's easy to determine what that is. My sense is that it will be under 100 at current prices. Remember, when crude prices go up, those things will go up. The thing that should bother us really are the other components of that template, right? There is the 8%, which is other charges, right, included in the landing. And there's the other bit, another, say, 16 to 17%, that is distributor. So I think there is quite a few items there that I consider inefficient, right? So the question is, are we really paying the real economic cost of this? And that's why I think a market-based solution, markets work. When you go that route, it relieves, and then forces of demand and supply will drive these things. So I think that today in that template, there's a lot of fat that can be cut off. That's my sense. So yes, if we deregulated today, prices hopefully should come down. But again, in the near term, they will go up until you get the supply side, because there are 2 components to this. There's the demand side, which we know exists. There's the supply side. The supply side today is mono source. We need to move away from that to get the full benefits of the regulation. So there's quite a bit of work to be done there.
All right, Chairman of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, Nigerian Council, Mr. Joseph Wakwe, thanks for coming on Business Morning.
Thank you very much, madam.
All right, let's change gear now. The Board of Directors of the African Development Bank over the weekend approved a $288.5 million loan to Nigeria to address the COVID-19 pandemic and mitigate its impacts on the economy. The loan approval comes just about 24 hours after the multilateral institution approved Nigeria's new 5-year strategy paper, the results of the participatory consultations with a range of key stakeholders drawn from state and non-state levels. We're now being joined by the AfDB Senior Director for Nigeria Country Department, Mr. Ebrima Fall, for some insight into these key developments. Good morning and thank you for joining us on the program. But just before the AfDB announced the approval of the $288.5 billion for Nigeria, the bank also approved the new 5-year country strategy paper for Nigeria. Was that some sort of corollary to the approval for the fund?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Yeah, the country strategy paper is a document that basically positions our engagement with the governments that we serve. And the one for Nigeria was ending last year, in fact. And we had planned to roll out a new one, and it's just sheer coincidence that the timing of the approval and the approval of the strategy document and the loan coincidence. But essentially, the strategy lays out the framework on how we're going to engage in various environmental development, and secondly, the need for support social inclusion through agribusiness and, of course, skills development.
Now, the new strategy paper is built on two pillars of infrastructure development and social inclusion. Now, talk us through the significance of these priorities.
Well, these are priorities that the government have prioritized both in the ERGP, but also in the 10 priorities of the second government of the Buhari administration. So we see these as pillars that, if appropriately implemented, will lead to massive productivity gains and be able to help support economic growth and lower, of course, poverty rates and inequality. The first pillar, infrastructure development, will focus on promoting, especially working with the government and the private sector to promote energy, the energy sector, of course, road transport and rail transport, and of course, other forms of transportation. We also look to invest quite a bit in water and sanitation services. That's for the first pillar. And the second pillar will focus around agriculture and agro-based processing. And there we'll focus a lot on skills development and trying to develop entrepreneurship programs that will create jobs and, again, be able to make our interventions more inclusive.
How would the bank join forces with the Nigerian government to implement these priorities?
Well, of course, the process of preparing the strategy is very consultative. Our primary stakeholder, of course, is the government. So we've met and discussed with all the ministries, with many of the states, and of course the private sector. So in implementing these programs, of course, we are partnering with the government, and through project implementation units, and of course through the government's own implementation ministries and the states as well. So it is a partnership, and that's premised on a lot of work in the knowledge front, but also a lot of dialogue with the government. And we do have monitoring and evaluation systems that will also inform us on how we are progressing with this.
But what for you were some of the successes and drags of the previous strategy paper 2013 to 2019, and what does the AfDB expect of the new blueprint?
That's a good question. In the last strategy, we were able to invest, I think, close to $4.5 billion to support the Nigerian development process in various areas. We supported energy generation and transmission, several water and sanitation projects, of course, agriculture projects, and of course, roads infrastructure as well. On the human capital side, a lot of activities around helping to develop skills and gender programs. So it was a very comprehensive and very far-reaching program. We are looking to, in this new country strategy, we're also looking to invest, just on average between $800 to $1 billion annually, which means that by the end of the program, we will invest about another $5 billion in the Nigerian economy. Our current active portfolio is actually that size, and it's changing. It's a dynamic thing, but roughly our average active portfolio in Nigeria, in all the sectors I just mentioned, total about $5 billion as well. So we're quite excited about this. We also would like to partner and are partnering with other development partners like the World Bank and others to make sure that our interventions are at the right scale and are reaching the right people. So all of this, I think we're quite excited with the opportunity to be able to contribute to this process.
Mr. Fowl, tell us, what are the terms and conditions tied to the just approved $288.5 million fund to Nigeria?
Yeah, this is, as you know, the fund is a timely response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're trying to support the government to strengthen the health systems, but also to respond quickly to testing needs and other isolation centers, etc. The terms of the loans are quite concessionary. It's a long-term loan of up to 25 years. And the rates are based on LIBOR plus just 0.8 basis points. So you're looking at very low interest rates and very long tenure for this loan.
So when is the bank looking to disburse this fund to Nigeria?
We anticipate that we should be able to disburse this funds by the end of the month or early in July.
Well, Nigeria had some running facilities with the bank. What happens to the loan servicing now?
Well, we think if you look at Nigeria's debt situation, I think it is exaggerated sometimes. I don't think that we actually don't believe that Nigeria has a debt crisis in its hand. I think what we have seen is that there's an issue with debt servicing, definitely, because a large part of revenues is going to service debt. But if you look at most of that debt is domestic debt. Domestic debt, it's not international. So whereas Nigeria would have been forced, probably, if it had access to go to international markets to borrow at very non-concessional rates, the loans provided by not only us, but the IMF, and also I anticipate that the World Bank will be providing some loans. These are very low interest loans that allow the government to recover from this crisis, while not necessarily making it difficult to service the debt by borrowing in international markets.
You mentioned now that the loan is concessional, but I'm sure many would like to know what the timeline is for servicing it.
Yeah, I think this particular loan, like I mentioned, the tenure is 25 years. That's a very, very, very long-term loan.
So the AfDB actually expects this facility to help cushion the effects of COVID-19 on the economy, just like you rightly mentioned now. But are there any key areas that you expect the funds to be channeled to particularly?
Well, we have worked very closely with the government in the areas that they prioritize. And I think testing is one area that the government has prioritized, and I think in line with WHO guidelines. So testing is one area. I think the ability to also support the private sector to be able to manufacture testing kits and other paraphernalia that are needed for this pandemic also would be very important. We also look to see if we can support local manufacturing in those areas. The third area would be to try to see how we can also help vulnerable groups by cushioning some of the impact of this pandemic and the economic fallout from the pandemic in some of these more vulnerable groups.
Are there any monitoring mechanisms that the bank has put in place to track the use of the fund?
Well, the government has systems in place, and we try to, of course, depend on government's country systems. We are very much pleased and encouraged by the systems that the government have put in place, including the open treasury accounts, the monitoring mechanisms through the Auditor General's office. And of course, we work very closely with the implementation units to make sure that projects are being implemented so that we can get the results, intended results that we want from it.
We would like to thank you, AfDB Senior Director for Nigeria Country Department, Mr. Ibrahim Fall, for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Time now to head to the UK, where new rules requiring all people arriving in the UK to self-isolate for 14 days have come into effect today. Well, let's get a sense of how this is playing out with Juliana Olayinka from our London studio. Good morning, Juliana. So Britain's three biggest airlines, talking about BA's owner, IAG, along with Ryanair and EasyJet, have started legal proceedings against the government in a bid to overturn the quarantine rules which take effect from today. Tell us how that is coming up.
Good morning, Bissy. Well, despite intense lobbying, as you said, today is the day where if you're coming to the UK, you will have to quarantine or self-isolate for 14 days. It's a legal requirement, and anybody who doesn't do so will face at least £1,000 fine or indeed face a prison sentence. This has been having lots of criticism. Loads of people have been venting their anger towards the government, and particularly the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And there was hopes that last week when she spoke at the House of Commons dispatch box that there may be a U-turn, but there hasn't been. And IAG, the owner of British Airways, they have started legal proceedings. They wrote a protocol letter to start these proceedings to the government on Friday, and that was backed by their rivals EasyJet and Ryanair. And the issue they have is that they say this is going to completely cripple the already struggling airline industry. Around the world, it has about 500 million people that it employs. And already, even though so many people in the UK are on the furlough scheme, thousands upon thousands of jobs will be axed in the next couple of months. And they just don't understand why the government have decided to do this, particularly as it's coming in so late. Earlier on in the year, a lot of borders were doing this, a lot of places across the world, and they're wondering why now, when so many nations are opening up their borders, that they have decided to do this. Particularly as well, Britain obviously has the second highest rate of COVID-19 deaths in the world, and the airline bosses are saying it should be the other way round. It should be other countries that are stopping or quarantining British tourists, not this way. So the legal proceedings are still very much in their early days, and we're likely to see what happens in the next couple of days.
While we wait to see that, now, a report by the Recapitalization Group has issued a stark warning over government loans to help businesses through the coronavirus crisis, saying that up to £36 billion worth of government-backed business loans could turn toxic by next year. What's behind this warning?
Well, what's behind this warning is just the amount of money that's creeping up in bad debt, or presumably bad debt. That's what the Recapitalization Group has been doing. They've been working with a city lobby group to try and find a private sector solution to COVID-19 piling debts. And they've had a look at three of the big coronavirus schemes. There's the bounce back scheme, which was given to Britain's smallest businesses, where you could apply for up to £50,000 and receive that money within days. There's also the coronavirus business interruption scheme for larger companies. And then there's a larger scheme still where some people were getting up to £1 billion to keep their business afloat. At the moment, all of these schemes have cost the government about £36 billion. That's expected to rise by over £100 billion next year. And the fears that have arisen by this data shows that a lot of these businesses that are taking out this money may not be able to pay these loans back. And if they are able to pay the loans back, they could stop them from growing. And of course, if you want your economy to grow, you need your small businesses to grow. So this is the information that's been given to the Bank of England, and they're asking them to perhaps suspend some of these loan repayments for other things, perhaps asking companies to take money out of their pension schemes, also rising tax in certain areas to stop the repayment. But it's lots of food for thought because, of course, Britain is bracing for their next quarterly GDP rating. And they're saying if they keep loaning out this money, then it may not hit the pockets now, but it will certainly hit the pockets in 2021.
It's a new week, Juliana. Tell us, what are we to look out for?
Well, it is a new week. I suppose here in Britain, the main thing everybody is going to be looking out for is on Friday, and that's GDP data for April. In March, GDP declined by 5.8%. Of course, we know that March, you only had a week worth of a shutdown because Prime Minister Boris Johnson asked people to close their shops on the 23rd of March. So in just a week, we declined by 5.8%. April, there was a complete and entire shutdown. So there are some economists that are predicting GDP to show that it's fallen by 18% on Friday, although there are some economists that predict it could be as large as 31%. So lots of people are waiting on that. The FTSE has started on the red. It's opened lower this morning, so it's a pretty dull week. But of course, a lot of attention is going to be on the airports and to see how many passengers are coming into British shores, even though they have to self-isolate for 14 days.
Thank you, Juliana. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Temple Ashaju is ready to take us through last week's market activities, beginning from the local equities market. Good morning, Temple. So investors didn't have a swell time last week. What happened?
Well, to some extent, some investors also had their swell time, while some actually had a little bit of bad mood for the weekend. That's because there was so much of profit taken in the system, and that in a way affected some of their investments. And of course, in the course of the program, when we join our guest, our analyst to talk to us, we'll be able to understand the next direction of the market, for the week. But let's quickly look at how we settled for last week. 0.1%, specifically 1% decline in the index, and that translates to 118 billion naira decline from the equity capitalization, because if you take that off with the 13 points, close to 10 trillion naira that we had last week, this is what it brings us to. And that's because of the loss of 118 billion naira that we had during the week. If you look at the activity level, volume of transaction was actually negative by some 30% or thereabouts. But if you look at the value of transactions, it was really positive, more than 4% high. You look at the likes of FBN Holdings that contributed to that in terms of the volume of transaction and the value of transaction. In terms of value of transactions, Dangote Cement also contributed more to the value of transactions here. We saw over 6 billion naira exchanged on the share price, on the stock of Dangote Cement. Guarantee Trust Bank also contributed to that, and Zenith Bank contributed more to what we have here in terms of the value of transactions. Deal for the week was actually 22,911 for the entire week. Look at the banking sector in terms of the sectoral performance now. Banking stocks were down. That's as a result of losses, as a result of profit taking that we've seen across the counters. If you recall, some 2-3 weeks backwards, this counter was actually blazing the trail in the market. We saw a lot of investors picking the low valuations and beginning to bet on the stocks there. But if you look at what we had for this week, Stanbic IBTC was down by more than 7%. It was we also got some 0.4% decline in the share price of Axis Bank, and then a couple of other banks. All of that contributed to what we had here. That's profit taking. So with the prices now seeing new rates at this point, we do hope that investors will be able to capitalize on the stability and, of course, the state of those new prices and be able to push their funds into that. If you look at the consumer goods segment of the market, given the profits taken across sectors, consumer goods sector was the only one that was positive, and of course that's because we got 15% gain on the share price of Dangote Sugar Refinery, which is paying out 1 naira 10 kobo in dividend. Industrial goods side of the market, Boa Cement lost more than 4%, and of course WAPCO declined as well. Insurance segment of the market was down as a result of the profit taking that we saw on Mansard Insurance, and oil and gas segment of the market experienced a 1.35% decline in for the week, and that's as a result of the profits taken that we saw on O&O, which has also been gaining in recent times. Rotimi Fakayi-Joy, stockbroker with the Nigerian Stock Exchange, joins us via phone. Mr. Rotimi, thank you for joining us on the program this morning. With what we saw in the market last week, equities, can you tell us if these losses have bottomed out and this week promises better returns for investors?
Definitely. I think you've done very good work in analyzing how the market was last week. Basically, what we are seeing now is a new low and a new high because of the pandemic, which resulted in lockdown. But looking at the week, I think it's sure going to be 2 weeks up, 1 week up, 1 week down. And we saw last week down. So investors have nothing to fear at all. There should be no need for panic. I want to believe strongly that this week we definitely turn out better than what we saw last week. I look at Bois Cement, which was one of the major losers on Friday. I think it's trying to change direction this morning, having gained 4 naira in early trading. So I believe strongly that the banking sector too are also changing direction or upward. So in that wise, we definitely really begin to see a new dimension to the market this week. So investors have nothing to fear, and I believe strongly that however way it is, except for some unusual reasons, the market will likely close positive at the end of the week.
All right, Mr. Rotimi Fakai, just stockbroker with the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Thank you for that insight. You heard it, investors. What he's saying is that prices are going to find a new direction this week and you have nothing to fear. Well, basically, before I round off with you, look at the numbers for the NASD OTC, positive for last week. And of course, volume of transaction is here. NDEP contributed to that. If you look at bonds segment of the market, things were very bullish in terms of bonds last week. Generally, NCB we saw more of profits taken, especially on 13th of May 2021 paper, but we know that some 821 billion naira is to be rolled over in auction rather on NCBs this week by the DMO, for the third quarter of the year. So we'll continue to watch this space as things pan out for the rest of the year. BC.
Yes, indeed, Temple, and we hope that the week actually turns out better at the local equities market. Thank you, Temple.
Thanks.
And that's where we end today's program. Thank you for watching. I am BC Adebayo.